Tomorrow starts without me. There's something you should know. While I hold you close, never let you go.
Hello and welcome to The Broken Pack, a podcast focused on giving adult survivors of sibling loss a platform to share their stories and to be heard, something that many sibling loss survivors state that they never have had. Sibling loss is misunderstood. The Broken Pack exists to change that and to support survivors. I'm your host, Dr. Angela Dean. I had the pleasure of speaking with Stephen Petro. He is an award-winning author and journalist, but most importantly for this episode, he is a brother. In this interview, I learned a lot about Julie and who she is, as well as how Stephen processed her dying and death, about the sibling relationship, both theirs and in general, about cancer, connection, and so much more. Take a listen.
Second guessing, 'cause you never know, you just never know.
Content warning. This episode discusses medical aid in dying. All right, welcome to the show. I'm so honored that you've agreed to do this interview. What would you like our listeners to know about you?
Well, I'm also glad to be here with you.
Thanks.
Words are funny things. I'm glad to have a conversation with you. Circumstances are ones I wish that I didn't have, but that's one of the lessons out of all of this. So I guess, what do I want people who are listening to know about me? Probably the most important thing is that I am the brother of Julie Petro Coley. Although she did pass in last 2023, I get confused about my tenses on purpose because I don't think, and I don't know if it's actually grammatically correct to say I was the brother. I think I still am the brother. So that's the headline. I'm a writer. I write nonfiction books. During Julie's illness, she had ovarian cancer for about 6 years. I wrote 2 books. The first one is called Stupid Things I Won't Do When I Get Old. And that was a lot about my parents and all the things that Julie and I and our brother thought they were doing wrong, that we were for sure going to do better. And I'll speak for myself. Not sure that's as easy as I thought it was when I wrote that post. The second book is called The Joy You Make, which will be published in September. And it's about how to find joy in challenging times and dark times, which was really my lifeline during much of Julie's illness.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested to hear more about that and definitely look forward to reading that book. How have you been able to find joy through grief and loss?
So part of what I learned in doing the research for this book, and I neglected to say, by day, I'm a journalist. I write for the Washington Post. So I have decent, if not good, research skills. We tend to think of joy as the firework. It's the big emotion, and it's orgasmatic in some way. But as I both was reading in the literature and experiencing life, there are all kinds of joys. There are smaller joys. There's anticipatory joy. There's the weird joy of Schadenfreude, which is we take joy out of the mishaps and misgivings of people that we know. So I came to see that there's a lot of different joy out there in the world, and I didn't have to just be trying to find the big bang of one. What I learned mostly during this journey was about how important connection is to others in both creating gratitude and creating joy. During Julie's illness, we'd always been close as siblings. We developed an even closer relationship that really fed me, and I think fed her, giving us this notion of a lifelong joy. And that was true for our entire family. We've been very open. Julie led the discussion about death and dying and how to talk about these topics. We all kind of joined her in that conversation, and that brought us closer. I remember early on, before we started this conversation, I said to Julie's best friend, Jenny, I think she's going to die. Jenny said, well, why don't you talk about that with her? She already knows. And that was part of the process of coming out, so to speak, about all that. But connection is very important to joy. So it was a major theme of my experience during her illness.
I wholeheartedly would agree with that as far as joy. I love how you pointed out the different aspects and definitions of joy. In my work as a psychologist, something that people struggle with. They just want to be purely happy in the way that society tells us that we should be.
What's interesting is that they want to be happy, and a lot of people conflate joy and happiness. And I have to admit, I was one of them at a certain point. But when you think about it, one of the beauties of joy is you can experience other feelings along with joy. You can feel sorrow. You can feel grief. Happiness in a way is, hog center state. You feel happy and sad. You're happy. That is the way I've come to understand it. It's more the shiny cousin of joy. It's more driven by external circumstances. You got engaged. You got a job promotion, a fantastic vacation. I'm happy. One of the scholars I interviewed said basically, joy is a mile wide and a mile deep. Happiness is like an inch wide and an inch deep.
Yes.
I'm not dissing happiness because when all those positive emotions, it was.
Yeah. Thank you for that. You mentioned that you had a close relationship with your sister. Do you want to say more about that or about her?
Yeah. So I was the oldest of three. She was the youngest. My brother is the middle child. And we were both always troublemakers. I was known as the troublemaker. She was known as the instigator. I'm a word person. I'm not really sure what the difference is. Except we were basically always up to something, often pinning it on our brother, the mediator. So we've had that sort of innate connections to start off with. And then as things turned out, we were both queer. And that's something that I learned about her, I guess when I was about 20. She was 16 and I was in college and I came home for one of the holidays. And because we had been close and because I had started coming out, I wanted to tell her, but I wasn't very good at it or very experienced at that. I made a mess out of it and finally just said, I'm gay. And I remember, so we're in her childhood bedroom and she started laughing and she always had this very Julie laugh. And I thought to myself, this probably was a little bit ahead of the game. She can't quite process. And then she says, well, when she can finally breathe and speak, I think I'm a lesbian. I've already had a girlfriend or I have a girlfriend. I remember saying to myself, because I didn't really know any lesbians then, oh my God, my sister's a lesbian. So that was a real bonding moment. We had others along the way for sure. I had testicular cancer in my 20s and both siblings were very attentive and we were very close. So when Julie got sick 6 or so years ago, I was able to step in a certain way and be her advocate, do a lot of research. I'm a health journalist. I have a fair amount of chutzpah or moxie, so I'm not afraid to call anybody and ask for something, especially when it concerned her.
The protective big brother with resources sounds like a good thing to have. It's very evident that you loved her very much.
Agreed. Well, I hope.
Yeah. I've read several of your recent pieces and I'm intrigued by both the cancer etiquette piece that you just wrote, especially given what I do professionally, and also the reason that we're talking. I read your article on medical aid in dying. Do you want to share more about that and Julie's process?
Sure. So medical aid in dying, it's also, as it's known as death with dignity, the right to die, called different things in different states, and the terminology has evolved over time. It is basically an individual taking end-of-life medications to hasten their own death after they have received a terminal diagnosis. Julie lived in New Jersey, which is one of the 10 states where MAID, as it is called, is legal, plus Washington, D.C. Very early on in her illness, I would say maybe in year 2 or year 3, over 5.5 years, she began researching it and trying to understand how you needed to qualify so that if or when the time came, she was ready. And that's always how she was. She hoped for the best, she planned for the worst, and she tried to live in the moment. So by the time this became a conversation within the family, which was around the time she decided to end treatment a year ago this week, actually, she knew the ins and outs of it. She knew you need to make several requests, oral, written. You can rescind at any time. You need one doctor to sign off. Then you need someone else who's a medical professional to sign off who has no interest whatsoever. So she and her wife, Maddie, who was her life partner, spouse, all of this for 35 years, they did all of that together. She didn't know, like many people don't know, whether she was going to exercise that choice. But I can say the fact that she knew that she had that up her sleeve, so to speak, gave her a great deal of comfort in terms of knowing that she could end her pain and her suffering if or when it became unbearable. And we had come to understand from her oncologist that because she already had liver metastases, they would likely continue to grow. And that would be fast and a painless death. Unfortunately, that turned out not to be the case in her situation. And there were more and more pain medications involved, fentanyl, morphine patches. And she was still in a great deal of pain. And so in mid to late June last year, she decided, this isn't going anywhere positive. I'm in an incredible amount of pain. It's time to exercise this choice. That's why I signed up. And they already had the medications in the safe at that point, 4 or 5 that you mix apple juice and then you take a big chug. So she was prepared and she had prepared us as well. And I have to say, I had to travel a little bit of distance over time to be there because initially when we started talking about MAID, I remember saying to some friends, so we're going to know that Julia is going to die on this day at this hour. That was so unfamiliar to start off with. It was so finite. And for me, it was all mixed up with she was going to be gone then. She was going to leave us. And I guess 2 things happened during that period of my transition. One, I saw her suffering deepen, and it was very clear to me it was time for an out here. Yeah, so basically during that time, I saw that she was suffering a great deal more. It was time. The other part was saying that I supported her choice to use medical aid in dying did not mean I wanted her to die, did not mean I wanted her to leave us. I had to tease those 2 apart. And I think that actually, even in just talking to you now, that's still just hard for me. The finality of her not being here is still very hard. It's about 9 months later. I know that sometimes my mind, it just turns into a blizzard when I go into some form of overload or denial.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. And I think even with chronic illness in which we anticipate somebody's death, so that anticipatory mourning state that you can get in, you still don't know when the person's going to die, unlike with medical aid and dying. And so it sounds like that was a unique aspect to processing this grief, but also being able to say, I support you and I desperately don't want this.
And she was very clear. I don't want to leave you well. That was about the last thing she said. We're so binary in this world these days, this or that. And this is a really good example of trying to hold 2 things at once. It will ease her suffering, and this is going to be hard for us to leave each other.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess the other thread in all of this is Julie wanted me to talk about this after she died. She wanted me to talk about her mindset, talk about her decisions, talk about why this is important for more people to have the choice. It was really by circumstance that New Jersey was one of the states and that they lived in New Jersey. Most of the country does not live in a place where it's legal. Most states that have MAID currently do not allow non-residents to just come over and do it there. A few do. I'm not 100% sure about those. It's a topic that's hard to talk about in the media because it falls then into the larger challenge that we have about talking about death and dying. We don't like talking about that in our culture. I've done a fair amount of research on sort of American customs around death and dying. And if you go back 100 years ago, older people, sick people, they were in the home. There weren't hospitals in that way. There weren't hospice buildings. There weren't continuing care facilities, which is where a lot of people who can afford it go. It takes that chapter out of our view and makes it perhaps more comfortable in a certain way, but it really, I think, exhibits the fact these are themes and topics that are very challenging to most of us.
Yeah, for sure. Some of that history around how this shifted had to do with the Industrial Revolution and when hospitals became the place that people became ill and therefore died in a facility outside of the home. I'm a fellow in thanatology for the Association of Death Education and Counseling. And this is part of our history, is understanding that at some point people didn't die in the home and nobody wants to talk about death and dying. No one's comfortable with it in the same way. Not no one, that's a blanket statement, but that shift, I think that's reflected in the difficulty with medical aid and dying, because I think I want to also clarify, and you've probably researched this as you've looked into MAID, but it's not called assisted suicide like it was referenced. Dr. Kevorkian was doing his thing.
Right.
The distinction there is really important, and I think our listeners need to hear that, because people like your sister don't usually want to die, but they're already dying. And so this is a choice that's not about suicide. And I don't know what you want to say about that or your thoughts on that.
Well, also, the phrase assisted suicide says rather explicitly, there is an assistant.
Right, exactly.
What a main distinction, as I understand it, is, and I'm most familiar with New Jersey in terms of the law, you do not have a medical professional participating in the provision of the medication, or if you're in Canada, the IV method. You have to be able to ingest this medication, this cocktail by yourself, which is what happened. Julie had this wonderful hospice nurse who had to be outside of the house until after she had swallowed the medication, and then she's allowed to come in. So there could be no question that Julie did this herself. This was her choice. And that is a very important distinction. Words matter so much in this culture, and people on all sides of the political spectrum use words and language to inflame issues. And so suicide is often used these days to camouflage what is a very different process. In the same way, I've heard some of those who are opposed to medical aid in dying say that you have to, or the patient has to, the person has to take 100 pills. And I thought that initially myself. And I thought, my God, I can't stand to take 3 big vitamins. I don't know if the equivalent is of 100 pills, but they're capsules that are emptied out already. So you're dealing with a fine powder. And then you think about mixing that with a liquid. That is a very different visual to understand, just in terms of one comfort. And then having spoken to some of the medical doctors who work in this area, they can do practice sessions with other types of medications. Sometimes I understand you can do it rectally, but there are ways for doctors who really know what they're doing to make this as easeful as this can be. Is that your understanding too?
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah. What kind of conversations did you have with Julie as you were trying to navigate your understanding of it?
So when I was going through my internal dissonance, I kept that to myself. I know other members of my family had the same dissonance, not wanting her to leave us. But I did not want to ever say to her anything other than, I support you in what you are choosing to do. That had long been my understanding of being her brother. And in this instance, it mattered even more so. We talked about it amongst ourselves sometimes. We talked about it with friends and in therapy. But I wanted her to know that we were all on Team Julie. I was on Team Julie. And that was that. And then I internally came to the place that I needed to be. I think that support mattered to her. And also, she did not waver. She remained focused on this as first the choice and then the way to end suffering, her suffering. And I remember the night before, and our whole family was together, I wanted to say, it's okay if you change your mind. But I didn't say that because that just seemed to then possibly open up a door of doubt of some sort. And she was steadfast, and I wanted to follow her in being steadfast. And we did.
That's admirable.
She always had a great sense of humor about everything. Her friend Michelle made this key lime pie for dinner for that last night, and Julie really wasn't supposed to eat and really couldn't eat, but she did have a couple of bites. And she said, a sweet tooth doesn't even die when you're dying. She really enjoyed those couple of bites. And her humor carried us a good bit of the way, too.
Does it still carry you?
Yes. I've known in the family and funny bone is not the right way to say it. Here's how to say it. So at her memorial service, 5 days after she died, I acknowledged her. I was her brother. She was a lesbian. And then I told this story about how she just loved men in uniform. A passion that I also love. And then there was, in the sort of carousel of photographs, there was one of her with these 2 emergency service workers that was probably about a year old that had come up. So I told that story. And then I said, and this is where Julie would say, Stephen, you are so bad. and I always loved when she said that. I miss when she says that. Now, many people in the family say that to me, Stephen, you are so bad. Not something that I had planned, but it is something that's part of my personality that if I think it's going to ease the situation, I might lean that way. But I also am careful not to fill up hard moments, confusing moments, painful moments with something that might be a quick hit or something like. So it's a real balance. Probably during her illness, I learned more about all of that.
Learning to tolerate the distress and sit with it uncomfortable versus feeling it to avoid it. It's a hard lesson to learn.
Yeah, it has been hard. A lot of times somebody within the family, and she was married to Maddie. She has these 2 wonderful girls in their 20s, my brother and his family. We all bring her up in conversation regularly. There's a lot of storytelling. There's a lot of memories. Julie loved amaryllis, and that from our mother, who would give everybody in the family an amaryllis, and we'd all watch them grow, bright and sparkly. And then Julie started doing that. And then the last year or two, many of us in the family were sharing them. And so we've been posting photographs of our amaryllises as they bloom since Christmas. And her friend Michelle, who was the baker of the key lime pie, sent one around today. Glorious red. Her husband, Tim, had taken a mirror and illuminated it. So it was just like on fire. And we all just have this moment on text of being one. My text threads are just filled with amaryllis photographs.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hi, I'm Dr. Angela Dean, host of the Broken Pack podcast. If you've lost a sibling, you viscerally understand the complexity of your loss and how isolating it can feel. Sibling loss is misunderstood, and that's why I created an in-person retreat called the Sibling Grief Refuge. It's happening this August 15th through the 18th near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This retreat will include grief-focused activities and sessions curated and facilitated by compassionate grief experts, including me. It's a space where your grief, your loss, and your sibling will be honored and understood. In addition to grief discussions, education, support, and togetherness, you will be tapping into your continuing bond with your sibling through multiple activities, such as going on a photo walk or sensory exploration and mindful walks. In our remembrance ceremony, you'll have further opportunity to honor your sibling, share your story, and hear about others' siblings. For more information, visit thebrokenpack.com/retreat, or just head to thebrokenpack.com and click the Sibling Loss Retreat link in the top menu. Spaces are limited, so secure your spot today. Let's walk this path of sibling grief together. Now back to the show. It's beautiful. Can we go back to, you said that she wanted you to advocate for MAID.
She wanted me to be her voice on this. As a journalist, I have to be careful about not advocating for partisan or political issues. So I don't describe myself as an advocate in terms of this, but I feel very strongly that I am her voice.
That makes sense. Thank you for the distinction.
My editors would be happy to have heard me and know that I actually feel that one.
Is that difficult to navigate?
Yes. Because in this very politicized time where perceptions matter as much as realities, I think journalists have to be very careful in their reporting, in being fair, in being equitable, and also not appearing to lean this way or that way. We have to sign a code of ethics every year. We have to re-sign. I can't go to fundraisers. I can't do a lot of things. I can't have a placard in my front yard for a candidate. That is really to instill trust in journalists that they are not beating the bush for this cause or that candidate at a time when there's just so much distrust anyway.
Thank you for clarifying. What do you feel the big message is that you want to share from her voice?
Really, the big message is MAID, medical aid in dying, should be a choice in every state for every person who is terminally ill. Yeah, a choice. That's very different than any kind of requirement or desk walk, which gets tied up in the fundamental argument that goes back to a woman's right to choose, that this is a human being's right to choose how they will live and how they will die. That's the number one message. And then the second level messages are around, and Julie and I had seen this as gay people when we were coming out. So I'm 66 and she would have been 62 next week. So when we were coming out, so many people in the U.S. did not really know gay and lesbian people. I mean, they certainly didn't know trans people. No. And so this lack of familiarity, this lack of understanding made it much harder for Americans to embrace this unknown, these unknown people, subject to many stereotypes. As time went on, as more people came out, workplace families, more and more people and more families knew someone who was queer. And that's how we saw attitudes change around acceptance. So she really was hoping that part of what I might be able to do is introduce her to more people after the fact. And so that she is a fully developed human being in the way I try to write about her. Her illness was one part of her life. How she died was one part of her life. Her smile was probably the biggest part of her life. Her daughters, her marriage. She was a 360-degree character. And that is what I've been trying to portray. And so it's probably been the most gratifying time for me as a writer, because when I hear back from people I don't know, wow, I got to know your sister. I got to see why she's special, how we're all special in ways. And also, she did this. Now I know someone who did this. Now I know a family who made. That's also part of what she wanted me to communicate.
I'm also now aware that most of our conversation has been about talking about how she died. And that's not usually how I start these interviews. Usually I'm really curious about the person that she is. So what do you want to say about her so that our listeners have a sense of who Julie is?
Well, we did talk a little bit at the beginning about,
a little bit
about coming out and that one of us was the instigator, the other is a troublemaker. But she was most proud of being a mom, the mother to Caroline, a mother to Jessica, and of being a wife. She and Maddie worked together for 35 years. I think they got married 4 times because of how the laws were. They got married in Canada. I think they got married on a Rosie cruise. They got partnered. They were very steadfast in creating the structure for family. About 10 years ago, Julie and Jessie, her eldest, testified in the New Jersey legislature for same-sex marriage. She was an advocate. Jessie's an advocate. Caroline's also a journalist, so I'm not going to put that on her. She really instilled that value. Actually, she made a video for the family before she died, probably about 9 months before she died, which we saw on Thanksgiving, which was about 5 months after she had passed. And that was the first time the family saw it. And it was set up, chapter about Maddie, a chapter about the girls, chapter about the brothers. And then there was this standalone chapter about politics and the right to choose and the right. So that right to choose is in your reproductive years and the right to choose in these later years. It's part of her lasting legacy to our family. So that's part of her. And then, so that was Thanksgiving. And then at Christmas, it was another side of her. So she was always in charge of the Christmas tree. And it was a big deal. We had grown up with Christmas trees. Maddie had grown up with menorahs, but they did a Christmas tree and Julie was always, this is how you do it. This is how you take it down. So the girls were going to decorate the tree for the first time without Julie. And they found a 4-page single-spaced letter from Julie in the Christmas ornaments detailing how to decorate a Christmas tree and how to pack up more. The season has come to an end. It was such a surprise to find it. It was so Julie. And she was working on it the day before she died. She'd been working on it for months, but she said, I've run out of time. I know you can do the rest by yourselves. She thought about everyone. She was really such a giving and caring person. At her service, I met a lot of her colleagues and a lot of her friends that I didn't know. She was the same Julie to all of them. And she'd worked at Citibank and Raymond James, these sort of flattened up places. But Julie was Julie there. They all loved her. They loved her spontaneity, the fact that she would bend rules, not break them, but bend them. So this was our Julie.
Thank you. I also feel like I know her a little bit. I have a sense. Yeah. So how are you doing with your grief?
So it's funny. I hear that question. I think, oh, Angela's asking me about my grief. This is my grief. I'm holding it right here.
Right.
It's this containable thing that I can now describe, which I can't. And it's not this containable thing. It's messy. It surprises me. It goes in waves. I'm trying to learn not to control it, but to let it be. And the lesson I'm drawing from is when I had cancer in my 20s, I had a lot of fear. I had fear of losing my hair. I had testicular cancer. I had fear of various sexual repercussions. Then I had fear of relapse and recurrence. And I had fear of not making it the whole way through. I had a lot of fear. And I tried to stay very buttoned up about that fear, locking it away. Put it in the safe and I'm going to go on with my life. And that's going to be that. That really didn't work very well for me.
Right. Of course it didn't.
I believe you would call it compartmentalization.
Something like that, yeah.
Professionals. And it could get out of the safe. And then it was like even more powerful. So I adopted this process of letting it out on a weekly basis. Literally, give it a name. I called my fear Max. I was doing volunteer work at Memorial Sloan Kettering when I started this. And so I was talking to other patients who had been diagnosed also with testicular cancer. And it was a time where I felt connected with them and that I could let Max out and do what he needed to do. And then he would go away until the next week when I went there. So I've tried to approach grief in the same way. And this reminds me that I probably need to give my grief a name because it really did help to refer to my fear as Max. So thank you for inadvertently suggesting that to me.
Oh, of course you did all of the work there, but you're
well,
welcome.
It's the question, which is to say it's impossible to keep at bay all of the time. So embrace it, understand what it is. And this is something that I still struggle with, but I'm learning that those feelings of loss, of sadness, of grief, they are manifestations of love.
Absolutely. I was just thinking that same thing.
And so I try to feel it that way. If I felt nothing, that would be worrisome. And when people tell me, not necessarily about a death, but if they've broken up with someone and they've been together for a long time, I feel nothing. I worry a little bit because that's walking a fine line. So I try to embrace it, which means still, though, that it comes at me. An example that comes to mind is about a week or 10 days before Julie died, we were in Manhattan. We stopped at a Chinese restaurant. We picked up Peking duck, one of her favorite dinners. She was hardly eating at this point. She ate half of that Peking duck. I've never seen someone so enjoy a meal. Greasy. It was beautiful. And then, I don't know, sometime in the fall, a friend of mine said, I'd really like to go to this new restaurant in Raleigh, Chinese restaurant, and we can have Peking duck. Yeah. And with all the best intentions, he did not know this backstory. I went right over the cliff into that grief space, remembering that wonderful sort of Last Supper, together. So there are a lot of triggers out there too. In that moment, I acknowledged it to myself and I said to my friend, here's why that's not a good idea for me right now.
I'm glad that you were able to recognize that and maintain your space the way that you needed to. I think it's also important, like grief, I think, and maybe this was implied in how I asked the question, but grief is the reaction to loss. So it's not always the sadness and all of the negative emotions. Just like you were saying before about joy, you can find joy in grief, and that's a challenging notion. So you not having this contained space for it, that makes sense because it's a whole bunch of other reactions too.
Yeah. After she took the medication, it took her about 5 hours to pass, actually, which made her a little bit of an outlier. And basically it was longer than we had expected. But we were all able to be there. We were all able to talk with her because they do say that one's auditory senses are the last to go. And there were moments of beauty in that time and moments of terrible sadness.
You also had time to think about losing your siblings, right? Many of my guests and my audience are younger, and that's not always the case. In fact, this season, that's definitely not going to be the case. But I wonder what that process was like. You've already lost your parents, from what I understand. And
I had long been wondering myself, would I want a fast death or would I want a slow death? Julie was ill for 5.5 years. Most of that time, she had a very good quality of life. Most of that time, she knew that it would not end well, as did most of us. It did allow us to live in a much more intentional way with each other, to say things that you might normally put off for another time, to talk through some things that needed to be talked through. She and Maddie did all of the legal financial planning themselves, but it was really the emotional work that we had time to do. And we had time. I do want to do a call out to this. There's an organization called Clarity, the Clarity Foundation, based in San Diego. They provide a number of services to people suffering from ovarian cancer and their families. Julie benefited from their educational director who would help her interpret different studies and clinical trials and so on. I had a therapist who I've worked with probably for 3 or 4 years now. All these services provided at no cost to individuals. So that was just a very helpful part of this in a way that we could use the time in more meaningful ways. And the therapist that I worked with, Whitney, she had done a lot of this work with other people. So she knew what that road looked like. Not that anybody's experience is the same. Not that she expected me to drive in the same way, but she had an understanding of that landscape that helped me to navigate it a little more without as much trepidation, I'd say. I think I might have wandered off of the question.
That's okay. No, I really think that's all valuable information as well. In fact, I'll put a link to Clarity in the show notes. It's definitely a worthy resource.
This is a topic you mentioned at the very top. I wrote last week for Maria Shriver's Sunday paper about cancer etiquette. And this was in regards, first of all, to Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose privacy was completely exploited by just about everybody who had a soapbox and was fueled by our hunger to know, where is she? Where is she? What's going on? So the piece talks about privacy as really the most important aspect of cancer etiquette, respecting someone's wishes. And if someone confides in you that they're ill, that does not mean you have any legitimacy to tell anybody else. There's a time when someone who is ill with cancer likely feels as though they don't have any control over their circumstances. And what is the one thing that we might be able to control? Well, that's our story, our narrative, how we divulge it. So I really felt that what happened to the princess was egregious and was a teaching point for the rest of us. Okay, so this is a way I hope that I'm going to be somewhat humorous. 2 months before Julie died, a good friend of hers that she grew up with sent a condolence letter to the family. You know, beautiful stationery, beautiful script, poignant memories. Julie's reading this out loud, laughing, touched. Oh, I don't remember the person's name, but I'm not going to say it anyway. But this is what so-and-so really thought of me. So it was a goof. And I had been saying, before you send a sympathy note, please make sure your timing is right. But in a sense, Julie was also very pleased to read this. And so, and some of the other things I talked about in that piece were that the importance of listening. And as we've talked a little bit, we're not such great listeners these days. We want to hear ourselves talk. We want to be around people who believe what we believe. Someone who is going through a cancer journey is going through their own thing. And even those of us who have had cancer, we can guess a little bit, but it's still not the same. So listening is also a really important part of that.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. Actually, when I read that piece, and then you're an expert on civility, as I recall.
I am considered that.
Yes. I was thinking actually about the two things in my head together this morning, knowing that we were going to talk today. I was thinking, so I have this line of cards that are really snarky about stupid things people say and grief.
Oh, agreed, yeah.
But mainly because people say things, oftentimes they don't mean harm by them, but they say things that are inappropriate or startling. And so I was thinking, is there a way to create a grief etiquette in the same way that we're moving towards etiquette with chronic illness?
I think very much so. And I've been doing it in sort of bits and pieces, but it's something that I've thought about doing in a more focused way. I'm sure. Well, will you put it in the show notes? Will you put a link to the cards?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll actually email that to you today, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because most of the missteps in this category, probably 98% unintentional. I know, I'm sure you know, it is hard. It can be very hard to know what to do or what to say. And I certainly have said stupid things, you know.
We all have.
I have a friend who's going through the process right now of being diagnosed, and part of me wants to say, everything's going to be all right. Well, I don't know that.
Right.
She doesn't know that. She's afraid now. That's the place where I need to try to join the conversation. And with all behaviors, especially if we're talking about etiquette or manners, there's a lot of follow the leader. So if we can establish better ways to convey ourselves, and whether that is listening, whether that is treating someone who is ill the same as we treated them before, and seeing people shout at someone who has cancer, not because they have a hearing loss issue, just because this is what we start doing when we someone is different, treating them the same. And we copy each other a lot. That's what this is about. So establishing more norms around this is good for all of us.
Yeah. I agree. You just reminded me of a memory of when my grandmother was dying and people shouting at her in the hospital because she didn't speak English. Yeah, and I think listening is key. It would solve so many of the world's problems if we could just listen. But if we start to learn to listen and see that the person, whether they're grieving or they have cancer or it's something we don't agree with politically or otherwise, and see the person as a human being, I think we'll start to say fewer of those inappropriate things.
I think so. I hope so.
Yeah.
Politics seems the hardest part of this, but it bleeds into everything else.
Mm-hmm.
To go back to medical aid and dying, that's become very politicized as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's become a red and a blue issue, which really upsets me, that it should be politicized in that way, that it should be binary, that we can't hear our loved ones and allow them to do what they want to do.
I'm curious about your statement there that it's become a red and blue issue, because the literature from the death and dying world says that is not true.
Well, the reason I say that is if you look at the 10 states plus DC,
Okay.
they're all blue.
Fair. That makes sense.
Used to go through state legislatures and it breaks down that way.
That makes sense. Okay. So the articles that I've read are based on probably quantitative and qualitative surveys that people are answering. So that makes sense.
I mean, you know what? So both can be true, which
exactly. I have a giant ampersand in my office because I often remind people that multiple things can be true at the same time. So thank you for the reminder.
Okay. Yeah. With a confirmation.
I think one other point about medical aid in dying that might be significant to realize is it's along those lines of why it's called that, but also another reason that it should be an option is the population with the second highest suicide rate are the elderly. And a lot of them don't have the option for MAID. So they are engaging in things that end up being rather violent ways to die because they're choosing suicide. They don't have a better way.
To your point, I had an extended family member who had terminal cancer in a state where MAID is not legal and he had to go. Mm-hmm. And it's horrible. It's horrible anyway, but that was horrible. But you remind me here, Julie gave me talking points. But
she didn't leave you a detailed list?
Pretty much, you know. She did. She noted that she was white. They had the income to afford $900 for this medication that was not going to be reimbursed by any insurance plan. And that, and she had access to resources. Most people don't. And so when you look at data about who goes through the process of qualifying for MAID, it is more educated people. It is people of higher economic income levels, white people. There's a real disparity of this and utility there. And that's not there. That's not equitable.
Yeah, it sounds like an opportunity. I'm attending this conference next week and I'm really curious to see some sessions on this very subject. I know that you have mentioned telling stories about Julie as being an important way to other people to know her. Mm-hmm. Do you have some favorite stories or memories that you want to share?
So I'm having sensory overload as we're here. Yeah, I have many qualms about Facebook, but one of the things that I've come to appreciate in the past year are Facebook memories, which will bring up posts or photographs on a particular date, and especially of Julie and me and our family. One that I know that is coming up. So her birthday is April 15th, which will probably be after this is posted. Yeah. Okay. So as every day as we're talking, it's April. So anyway, I know that's coming. And so this was the week that she decided to end treatment. And her doctor said at the time when she asked him, how long will I have? And he said 2 to 3 months. And at that point, Julie said, I want a really big birthday party next week. And our family loves having parties and our family loves having speeches. We've done that all of our lives. But this was hard to hold the celebration and the finality together. But we did. And we even had 2 different cakes, one to represent each of the themes going on. What I think was especially beautiful was that anyone who wanted to speak about Julie got to do that there, with her there, with all of us, each other. I think that was really powerful to friends and to family. And then her friend Val made this piñata that said, fuck cancer. And Julie, Maddie, and the girls went first in whacking this and breaking it. But it was like a great way to get out all of that anger as well, destroy the piñata at the same time doing something that's a party thing, birthday thing. So I hold that picture. This will remind me of that picture. Mary Frances O'Connor has written this really beautiful book about grieving. I think it's called The Grieving Brain.
It is, yeah. Great book.
And what she talks about there, or what I took away from that book is, so I think about her birthday. I think about the holidays we had. Julie was always front and center in those pictures, whether they were mental or literally photographs. So then you come around and they're not there. And that absence is so strong. It's so powerful, especially in the beginning times. Because you're having to almost reorient, remap your brain as to what does your family look like? What does your family look like without your sister? And or from my niece's point of view, their mother, or Maddie's point of view, her wife. And O'Connor has looked at scans and so on, has come up with some really fascinating stuff, what the brain goes through.
Yeah. It is a good read. How did you navigate what that looks like differently now with whatever you're comfortable saying?
It was before the holidays last year that I did read the book. It was still very hard. On the other hand, we talked a lot about Julie at the table. The year before, Julie had been giving really all of her cooking instructions to Jessie for the turkey, for the roast beef, in the same way that she did the Christmas tree. And so Jessie was going, we were really enjoying remembering, well, now is when Mom would put the tin foil on the turkey so that it doesn't get too brown or burn. And so she was very present in those ways. And there was a time right after she died, I thought, am I going to laugh again? And I was afraid I wasn't. And we all said both after Thanksgiving and after Christmas, because there was a lot of laughing. There was a lot of love. No. Yes, you will on your own time. You might not with everyone else. Laughter is also a way to express loss and love.
Absolutely.
So it did not feel like, well, we shouldn't laugh.
Thank you.
There's something I want to put on the table that we may be getting to. I don't want to.
No, go ahead.
And it's a topic of siblings. So yes, I have heard from many people. I'm so glad to have gotten to know Julie better. I'm so glad to have gotten to know your sister. And then it's been interesting because I knew Julie and Julie J and I, we had a special sibling relationship. And so then I've heard from other folks, other friends, I'm envious of the closeness that you had. I don't understand it, the closeness that you had. We don't talk about sibling relationships in the same way that we talk about parental-child relationships or spousal relationships. And this is something I'm just coming to understand myself. And NPR is doing a series this week on siblings. Oh. Which I highly recommend.
Plan to listen, yeah.
Yeah. And there's a whole new science of siblings that they're playing around with. But the real theme is siblings matter more than we've understood.
Yes.
And even when you don't have a good sibling relationship, the bonds that exist are unique.
Well, it's very formative, and partly how this whole organization that I founded started is sibling loss itself is misunderstood, largely in part because the sibling relationship is misunderstood, just like you said. But if you think about the sibling relationship, the duration of your sibling relationship is intended to be approximately ages and all of those things. Change this, but the statistics say 80 to 100% of your lifetime, you will have a sibling. So for Julie, she had siblings 100% of her lifetime. And we're supposed to outlive our parents and all of those things. And so the sibling relationship, who do you learn the social skills from and how to interact with the world? Surely your parents, but more so your siblings. There's that peer relationship and they're there for everything. So of course it's not understood in the same way. In some ways, it's more powerful. Right.
That's been my experience. When we also carried each other's secrets.
Which you get to carry for longer.
Right. And now I don't know where mine go.
There's the humor.
Maybe it's time to ask secrets. It's fun. But yeah, so it's a territory that I'm grappling with and realizing how special siblings are and how in our case, really how special our triad relationship has been.
Well, and to your earlier point, I think it's not always a close relationship, but it's still always an impactful one. So I've talked to siblings who are estranged from their siblings and maybe lost their sibling, or who are just estranged from their siblings, depending on where I'm meeting them, or they're not close, or they are. But the key thread is, in some ways, it forms our identity and who we are in our relationships and what matters most. So I'm definitely going to check out the NPR series. Thank you for letting me know about that.
Started a couple of days ago.
Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you wanted to dive into?
I think you've done a good job.
Oh, well, thank you. From the professional interviewer, I'll take that.
Yes. No. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and to express some of my own feelings. I was looking forward and having dread at the same time.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing and being vulnerable with it all. Thank you for sharing, Julie. I have a sense of who
you're
she
very
is.
well. Thank you for doing what you're doing too.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much for listening. Our theme song was written by Joe Millwood and Brian Dean and was performed by Fuji Sounds featuring Millwood. If you would like more information on The Broken Pack, go to our website, thebrokenpack.com. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter, Wild Grief, and to learn about opportunities and receive exclusive information and content, as well as grieving tips for subscribers. Information on that, our social media, and on our guests can be found in the show notes wherever you get your podcasts. Please like, follow, rate, subscribe, and share. Thanks again.
'Cause you never know, you just never know.